Hello, it's Catherine from the Catherine and Rachel podcast. We're here to help international lawyers, not British ones, not American ones, only the ones who have English as a second language with their legal English vocabulary, listening and pronunciation. That's what these podcasts are for. We are going to move you from very good general English to superb legal English. All you have to do is listen in. Now, this story is about, well, it seems unbelievable. It's about the link between a bridge, a serial killer, maybe more than one serial killer, and corporate negligence. How are serial killers, and I'll give you a clue, the biggest one in this story is Ted Bundy. If you've seen the Zac Efron show, you know exactly who that is. What is the link between corporate negligence and men like Ted Bundy? We're discussing a brilliant book by a brilliant author, Caroline Fraser, and she links these two things together very well. So to improve your legal vocabulary, your listening, and your pronunciation, you can check this podcast out, which is called The Bridge and the Serial Killer, and dive into the world of corporate negligence, which is right at the centre of the law of tort. Let's go. Hello again, Rachel.
Hello.
We've got a special episode today, haven't we? Because we've got a tiny anniversary.
Yes, it is our 10th anniversary of the podcast.
10th podcast.
It is.
We haven't been going for 10 years.
No.
10 weeks.
10 weeks.
And we just thought it would be nice to do something a little bit different.
Yeah.
So we're going to speak about the content of the most amazing, unique book from 2025 that we've both read.
I'm so excited for this episode because
yes, this is the most special book I've read.
When you recommended this book to me, I went in with absolutely no expectations and was just blown away by the way that the author creates such a really vivid story.
She does.
Yeah.
Let's just say who the author is.
Yes.
Her name is Caroline Fraser, and she's from the Seattle area of the USA. She is a Harvard PhD. She's won a Pulitzer Prize for writing, and in the interviews I've seen with her on YouTube, she is remarkably modest.
Yeah.
She doesn't ever mention her Harvard PhD or her Pulitzer Prize. It's always the interviewer. And she's written a book that is a kind of snapshot, like a frozen in time picture of what it was like to grow up in that area at that time. And it's not a book about serial killers, but there are a lot of serial killers in it.
Yeah.
And here it is. It's called Murderland, Crime and Bloodlust in the Time of Serial Killers. But we're not serial killer girls, Rachel. It's about an awful lot more than that.
Yeah.
And she sees the development of the serial killer as a product of the society that they lived in.
Yeah.
I think she starts by saying, in the Pacific Northwest of the USA, in the 1970s and 80s, life was cheap.
Yeah.
And from our point of view, because we teach lawyers and law students, I read it as a complete failure of many different types of law to prevent death and suffering.
Yeah, absolutely. There's a remarkable lack of responsibility throughout the entire book.
No one's liable for much.
Yeah.
And I was here in the 1970s. Okay, I was a continent away from Caroline Fraser.
Yeah.
But much of what she says, I think, yeah, it was like that, and it was considered normal, and the law wasn't really for the people who were suffering
Yeah.
and dying. Law was still something for the wealthy
Yeah.
and the privileged. Um, shall we start with the bridge?
Yes.
Because I don't know what your fears are in life, Rachel, your phobias, but I'm almost unable to walk over a bridge
I
if it goes over water.
Yeah, I totally agree. I am deathly afraid of anything particularly high up. And reading about some of the things that occurred on the bridge that we're going to be talking about. Oh,
Caroline Fraser, the author, lived on an island called Mercer Island, which is just off the coast by Seattle. Now, these days, Seattle is famous for coffee.
yes.
I think particularly
Yeah.
Starbucks is a Seattle company, and the music scene in Seattle and the markets and the food. But in the 1960s and 70s, it wasn't that way where Caroline Fraser grew
Yeah.
up. It was kind of a dirty industrial wasteland. And she lived on Mercer Island, and the only way to get to the mainland where Seattle was over the, let me get the name, the Mercer Island floating
Yeah.
bridge. Now, immediately I feel fear.
I think
Do you
it's the word
remember?
floating. I don't love
Well,
that.
for me, it's the distance. I'm used to bridges going over a river,
Yeah.
but this is a bridge connecting an island to the
Yeah.
mainland. So it's over very deep water and it's a very long
Yeah.
bridge. Now, where the lack of liability comes in is this bridge created numerous
Yeah.
deaths in horrific ways.
Yeah.
It injured thousands, but no one was ever held legally liable.
No.
So, shall we explain how this bridge killed people?
Yes.
The author blames the engineers, the
Yeah.
men who designed and built this bridge, and then maybe the local authority in the area who, when the deaths began, just kind of shrugged.
Yeah.
You know, people are dying. Bad luck.
Yeah.
Um, Two problems with the bridge. There were two bridges actually, and here are the things that killed people. The first one, which is really horrific, is a reversible traffic lane.
Yeah.
So the bridge has several traffic lanes, and there's one I think in the middle,
Yeah.
which sometimes the cars go that way, but when demand requires it, it has a light which switches and says, oh, now the cars are going that way. It's a reversible lane that, according to the light, takes traffic in different directions. And the locals were used to it.
Yeah.
They became accustomed to it. But if someone's just visiting the area and they don't know to look for the light,
Yeah, you're in trouble, I think.
so you've got a lot of really fatal
Yes.
head-on collisions on this bridge with hundreds of people killed. And the author names them.
Yeah. It
In this month of this year, this
yeah.
happens.
She's very, very frank, which I really appreciate in terms of, the serial killer aspect, but also just the everyday aspect of naming all of these victims, because it's very rare that anybody really cares enough to do that much research. And that was something that I immediately loved about this book.
Yes, she kind of honours
She does.
each individual victim in a way that's very
Yeah.
unusual. So the first problem with the bridge is head-on collisions, which are fatal.
Yeah.
And you mentioned a lady who survived, but she had terrible injuries
She,
and
yeah,
no compensation was
no,
paid.
she snapped her pelvis, which I can only imagine is the most excruciating pain.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
yeah, no compensation at all for that. Whereas now I think the common thing would be to put in a claim for that. And
Oh, well, this bridge would be closed now due to
yeah,
the sheer number of claims.
yeah,
The second reason, which I don't have the words for how awful this is, in the middle of the bridge, there's what the author, calls the bulge.
yes,
Now, when you look at a photograph of this bridge, the bulge is a circle right in the middle of the bridge, and that's so that the bridge can open
yeah,
to allow ships, tall ships, to go through. But what happens is people are driving at highway speed,
yeah,
not country road speed.
no,
This is a highway across the bridge, and they suddenly, in the middle of the bridge over this water, have to take a curve at speed. And this is where a lot of cars go over the
yeah,
edge into the water with people in them.
yeah,
And this happens week after week after week until it becomes normal.
yeah. It happens so often that it is normalized in the media. It's normalized everywhere in that particular place, and it's
And
horrifying.
horrifying. And Caroline Fraser, who is a child, describes her own mother
Yeah,
driving terrified
yeah,
across this bridge, but it's the only way to reach the mainland,
yeah.
so she has to.
Another thing about Caroline's writing style and the book itself is that she has such personal experiences in it, and you completely can empathize with the idea of her mother being in the car, being terrified to go over the bridge. It's
Yes,
something that I feel like I would have been the exact same way for.
me too,
Yeah.
me too. So why was no one held liable? Well, the law of tort, which would be the correct area of law,
Hmm.
this is negligence in many different
Yeah.
ways. It existed at this time, but I don't think ordinary people knew their rights
Yeah.
under the law of tort. As we said at the beginning, the law, private law, was for the wealthy
Hmm.
and the privileged. And if you are just an ordinary mother of a small girl driving to the shops, over
Yeah.
this bridge, it doesn't occur to you that someone is liable if you are injured or killed,
Yeah.
and that person should have to pay. And I don't know when the general public became really, really aware of that. In my mind, it might be with the movie Erin Brockovich.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah.
Have you seen that
I
film,
have
Rachel?
it. My mother loves Julia Roberts.
So you
Um,
watched Erin
so I
Brockovich.
have watched Erin Brockovich.
Well, for anyone who doesn't know, Erin Brockovich is a true story about a very small law firm who successfully sued a huge corporation
Yeah.
that was poisoning the water with chemicals
Yeah.
in a particular area and causing terrible childhood illnesses, adult
Cancers. It
illnesses,
was cancers and,
um,
and birth defects. It was awful.
birth defects. And I think for me, that's potentially when Julia Roberts appeared on people's
Yeah.
TVs in their living rooms that people thought, so if a corporation or a designer kills people, they should be held liable for it. But
Yeah.
at the time Caroline Fraser was growing up, the bridge killed
Yeah,
people.
absolutely.
And at the end of the book, because in a very interesting way, she goes on to link serial killers with a lack of corporate
It's
responsibility.
So fascinating.
She mentions the bridge so much because she quite rightly holds the bridge engineers equally as liable for death as the serial killers.
Yeah.
Same number of deaths, probably more.
Yeah.
So do look up photographs of the bridge so that you can see the bulge in the middle where so many cars plunged into very deep water, which is my personal nightmare.
Yeah.
I'd rather be surrounded by tarantulas and snakes
Yeah. No, thank
than
you.
even think about a bridge like that. So I think it's fair to say that that community in the islands on the Puget Sound, so there was Mercer Island, Vashon Island, and the Seattle community, they were absolutely failed by law.
Absolutely. Yeah.
And now they wouldn't be,
No.
which is enormous progress. Shall we move on to why this book has a picture of, do you know who that is?
That is Ted Bundy.
That's Ted Bundy. He's America's most notorious serial killer.
Yeah.
So how do we get from the bridge to a failure of law of a corporation or several corporations and link that to Ted Bundy?
It's so fascinating.
It's so fascinating. And if any of our listeners are international, I think it doesn't matter how well you speak English, you maybe don't know the words lead and smelter.
Yeah.
So lead is a metal, Lead. If you don't know what that translates as, do a quick Google Translate and find it. And a smelter is an industrial area, we would say industrial plant.
Yes.
Plant meaning huge factory. And to make it very simplistic, what a smelter does is you bring in the rocks that contain the lead and you burn those rocks to get the lead out of it. And one of the biggest smelters in the United States at this time was in a city called Tacoma.
Yes.
And she provides scientific evidence to back this up. But it's called, let me find the name of it, it's called the lead crime hypothesis.
Yeah.
And Caroline Fraser didn't invent this scientific hypothesis linking lead production and crime, but she picked it up and she ran with it and she took it all the way to Ted Bundy.
She makes links that make so much sense.
She does.
Yeah, it explains so much.
So what she says is, looking back on the area where she grew up, the Pacific Northwest, there was a sudden huge rise in crime throughout the USA and in fact in the UK in the 1970s and the 1980s. And it was a rise in violent crime.
Yeah.
And suddenly, in about the mid-1990s, it kind of stopped. It went back to normal violent crime.
Yeah.
And Caroline Fraser looked at why. And she found that in the city of Tacoma, this lead smelter was emitting from its chimney huge amounts of arsenic and lead particles. And in the whole area, children in particular had levels of arsenic and lead poisoning that were 20, 30, 40 times greater than normal.
Yeah.
So if you grow up in Vermont or Connecticut, which are rural, green, pretty states, you do not get the increase in the level of violent crime than if you grew up near Tacoma.
Yes.
And she says a terrifying thing. She says when she was born and taken home from the hospital in Seattle,
Mm-hmm.
within a small radius of her, there lived 3 violent serial killers.
Yeah. She says there's something like 55 serial killers in 1940, and that number escalates to, I think it's in the 700s by the 80s, which is,
So in the 1940s, you've got 55 serial
yeah,
killers in the USA.
yeah,
And by the 1980s, you've got
over 700.
over 700.
Yeah,
And she links that to the effects of lead poisoning and arsenic poisoning. And the smelter that's poisoning everyone is owned by a company called Asarco, which belonged to the Guggenheim family.
yes. A very, very big family.
A very, well, one of the billionaire
Yeah, one of the
families,
most
isn't it?
influential families.
And there's no indication in the book that the Guggenheim family knew personally about the lead poisoning.
Yeah,
But she provides facts to say, this is unbelievable. The management there knew about it.
yeah.
They did the mathematics in case they were sued.
Mm-hmm.
How much would it cost us to compensate for a childhood deformity? It's worth it because
Yeah,
the profits are so big. They did the maths.
yeah.
So before we talk about Ted Bundy and the serial killers, when I read the book, and I'm sure when you read the book, you thought, wait a minute, Caroline. If the whole area around Tacoma was being poisoned,
Yeah.
why are all of the serial killers men?
Yeah, it was something that I thought, and it was something that continued throughout the book. It shocks you until kind of the middle or the end of the book.
She explains
Yeah.
eventually, but I read it thinking, are you kind of pardoning these men
Yeah.
almost, saying it wasn't their fault, they lived near Tacoma?
Yeah.
But then she explains that it's because scientists prove that lead and arsenic poisoning has a much different effect on a man's brain than it does on a woman's
Yeah.
brain. And we do have a clip of the author being interviewed, which is available on YouTube, about how this affects men and women's brains differently. So let's listen to that, and then we'll talk about Ted Bundy.
We know quite a bit now, actually. I think that one of the sources that I was reliant upon is a book by this biologist named Adrian Raine, who wrote a book called The Anatomy of Violence. And he looked at a lot of different ingredients that can go into causing brain damage, which can vary, from actual physical damage from beatings, or like if you've been in a terrible car accident or something like that. If you have actual physical brain damage to your frontal cortex, and if you're a man, this can affect you in ways that you might not have imagined. And Rain looked at a whole suite of heavy metals, including lead, cadmium, arsenic, etc., and looked at the different kinds of effects you see on the frontal cortex. He also did a lot of MRI scans that actually show these areas of deficit, these kind of gaps or places where the organs of the parts of your brain that help control your behavior were actually damaged. or smaller than they should have been. And the effects are worse in men than they are in women. And I'm not sure that we know why that is yet, but there have been studies of this that definitely show that the male frontal cortex can be affected in ways that are lesser in women. In women, you tended to see more impulsivity, and there was a corresponding rise, for example, in teenage pregnancies, for example, that kind of track with the rise in violent crime, that shows, more impulsive, risk-taking behavior. But you don't see the same rise in violence among women that you did see in men.
Right. So I'm aghast at that. Why would women's brains be affected in such a different way?
Yeah.
What she says is women become more impulsive and they indulge in more risk-taking behaviour.
Yeah.
She doesn't mean they go to casinos and start gambling. She doesn't say it, but women become more sexually permissive.
Yeah.
And in a way, that makes them all the more vulnerable to people like
Absolutely. Yeah.
Ted Bundy. We mention him so often, and so does she, because he is by far the most famous and the most brutal, violent, terrifying serial killer that ever lived.
Yeah,
I
I
think.
feel like we need to have a small disclaimer that there is graphic kind of explanations of some of his crimes in the books,
There
but
are.
it's so incredibly necessary.
It is, because she says TV has kind of sanitized what serial killers do.
Yeah,
And if you think about, the Netflix shows like The Zodiac, Richard Ramirez, who both operated in this area. And the thing about Ted Bundy, the film about him, they had Zac Efron.
yeah, they did. And I think as a society, we are so desensitized to the work of killings and serial killers because we see that all the time on the news. We see it, all over Netflix. It's everywhere. But she has a really interesting way of making it feel relevant and really letting the crime sink into you. It's like how harrowing they really were.
Yeah, we should tell everyone that before they...
Yeah, before you go out and buy the book, which I
Before
do
you go out.
recommend
I
to
do too.
anybody who...
But she doesn't sensationalize
No.
it at all. It's
It's almost very matter of fact.
she
Yeah,
just so, and it makes it so, it has so much more impact. So she'll say, Ted Bundy got up that day. He went to a law lecture because he was a law student at the University of Utah. Everyone said he was extremely handsome, extremely charming, very well educated. He was studying law. So although he was an absolute monster, and she'll say he had breakfast, he went to buy petrol, she says gas, because she's American. He bought a slice of pizza, then he kidnapped, tortured, raped and murdered a young woman, and then he went to meet his girlfriend and they went to the movies.
And what I love about Caroline is that she tells us exactly what the victim looks like. She tells us what their interests were, if she knows them. She tells us perhaps even to the detail of what they were wearing, so that these people don't feel like characters, which I find that they often become in Netflix shows and things, because they don't focus on a victim. They focus on the killer.
They focus on the entertainment aspect of it. So we need to get to how Caroline Fraser links the Zodiac killer, Richard Ramirez, who was the Night Stalker, and of course Ted Bundy, to corporate negligence.
Yeah.
And the answer is Asarco, who owned the smelter, knew that it was poisoning people. They knew about childhood defects, and they maybe knew, I don't know, that it affected men in a particular way.
Yeah.
Because it wasn't just a rise in serial killer crimes, it was a rise in violent crime
Yeah.
from men in every area of crime.
Yeah.
And yet no one did anything about it. And it's not completely stopped because, speaking of Netflix, there are a lot of shows now about another corporation owned by the Sackler family who created the opioid crisis
Yeah.
in the USA. There's a drug called OxyContin that contains morphine, and the directors of that company encouraged doctors to go on prescribing OxyContin to people who had injuries like back pain or broken bones, or people who were recovering from surgery. But they knew that it was addictive and that it was leading to deaths and suicides.
Yeah.
And that wasn't very long ago.
It wasn't.
So, although there is more corporate responsibility now, and the owners of that company, the Sackler family, were pursued by lawyers and by police, it's still happening.
Yeah. What struck me, I think, was that the plant managers were actively producing, say, University of California professors who were arguing against anything that came out that said that this was a dangerous practice, and they were deliberately arguing against that and saying, actually, it's very safe. It doesn't cause cancer. It doesn't cause all of these issues, and that really struck me as incredibly irresponsible.
Well, corporations are kind of allowed to do that because if you look at company law, which most of our lawyers and law students do, there's no protection for the public in company law.
No.
It's all about protection of the shareholders and people who've got money in the company. Company law, sets out directors' duties, and the fact that directors have got a fiduciary duty to the shareholders, which means look after the shareholders. Nowhere does company law really say thou shalt not kill.
No.
Or don't injure people, don't knowingly injure people. And if I became Prime Minister tomorrow, I would put that into company law.
Yeah, absolutely.
Now, lawyers listening are going to say, no, that's for criminal law, it's for the law of tort. But my point is, the law of tort and criminal law are not preventing it.
No, they're
How
not.
about if a company director knowingly allows a member of the public to be injured or killed, that company director is going to jail.
Absolutely.
How about that?
And I think, especially in my generation of people, we do expect that to happen. And when it doesn't happen, it feels like a massive failure.
It is a massive
So
failure.
I'm very much hoping that my generation will be the ones to push something forward.
Well, I think my generation was the first one to start shouting about it.
Yeah, absolutely.
But we're looking at a window in time. So lead, which is the problem, began to really get into the atmosphere when a lot of people got cars.
Yes.
And the lead was in the petrol.
Yeah.
It was in household paint. So if you were painting the walls in your house, it was even in the pencils that we chewed in school. And then when you add to that living next to the smelter in Tacoma, Ted Bundy lived in Tacoma with his mother. The level of lead poisoning was astonishing. And in the 1970s, I think my generation of women were among the first to say, hey, we'd quite like proper equality,
Yeah.
not just the vote,
Yeah,
which the
absolutely.
suffragettes fought for, but equality in all things.
Yeah.
Because all of these serial killer murder victims, well, not all of them, but
The
a
vast
huge percentage
majority.
of them are young, pretty women
Yeah.
or children. And the men that are killed tend to be because they were in the way
Yeah.
of the serial killer. A husband is shot because the serial killer wants to rape and torture the woman.
Yeah.
So my generation of women, I think, were the first to say, could we possibly have some kind of equality in the law that
Yeah.
we're not disposable?
Yeah.
And I think the generation that came after me, my children's generation, were probably the first to start making a noise about environmental law.
Yeah.
And because environmental law failed these people, I think because it didn't exist.
Yeah, absolutely. She has this wonderful saying of lead is like a vampire. Invite it in and it'll drink your blood and live forever. And
Oh,
yeah, it's such a powerful quote. But then you realise that even powdered arsenic was used to protect crops and things. It was used to make sure that insects didn't eat all of your vegetation. It's
so they were putting arsenic on the
on
stuff
yeah,
that people are going to eat. Yeah.
yeah, and then obviously there was the uptake of violent children, and of course there was, because they were ingesting it, they were constantly surrounding it. It was
But
everywhere.
they were violent little
Yeah,
boys.
they
And
were
that goes back to what the author says about how lead and arsenic affected men and women
different.
differently. So you've got little boys doing awful things, and a man who lived in the same street as the author one day just deliberately blew up his
Yeah,
house with his wife and 4 daughters in the house. And it wasn't really for more than a day commented on,
yeah,
because this kind of violence and craziness was accepted as being the way men are.
yeah,
Um, so, Murderland, Crime and Bloodlust in the Time of Serial Killers, is a beautifully written, unique, very thought provoking book that I think will stay with us in our
yeah,
minds for
absolutely.
a very long time. Um, I'd just like to finish though. We've both avoided a feminist
Yeah,
rant about the position of women
yeah,
in the 1970s and
and
80s.
it's
And
something that we both are very staunch about. When we talk personally, it's something that we are both very, very passionate about.
we are.
Yeah,
And the book details the terrible, terrible suffering
yeah.
and death of hundreds of
Named
innocent,
and unnamed women.
named and unnamed,
Yeah,
innocent young women who weren't doing anything. They were asleep in their own beds in their own home. They were walking to a shop to buy some cigarettes. They were sitting at a music
yeah.
festival when a monster approached them and said, "Could you help me
Please,
with,
could you help me take this to
please,
my
could you help
car?
me?"
I'm
Um,
injured. Please help
so
me.
it's hard to read this book and to look at these crimes without fury,
Yeah,
for these women, for these victims. But even after Ted Bundy was found guilty by the jury, and the jury recommended the death penalty, and it's all on YouTube, you
yeah,
can watch it. Because he was a law student, the judge who condemned him to death seemed to do so almost reluctantly. And if you listen to the judge's tone of voice and listen to the judge's words, he kind of says to America's worst serial killer, "Such a shame
yeah. It's such a
you
pity.
kidnapped and murdered and tortured all those women, because you would have had a great career as a lawyer,
Yeah.
and now you've spoiled it."
He says, you could have been in my court.
I would have loved
I would
to
have
seen
loved
you
to have
in
seen you in
court.
my court.
So the fury in me continues because of that judge. Let's stop now. Let's recommend the book. It's not an easy read, but it's a
No,
brilliant read.
it's well worth the pain that
It's
it
worth the
hurts.
pain.
Yeah.
And let's finish with the words of that judge to anyone who thinks things don't still need to change. Bye-bye, Rachel.
Bye-bye, Catherine.
You're a bright young man. You made a good lawyer. I'd love to have you practice in front of me, but you went another way, partner. Take care of yourself. I don't have any animosity to you. I want you to know that. Take care of yourself.
Thank you.
Court will be in recess.